Hello again. Well, if you're in outside, you would have noticed that there are days when the sun feels hotter than you'd expect, despite it not being summer yet. Experts have been warning that the world is getting warmer and warmer. Experts are also saying this is due to the effects of fossil fuel emissions that are harming the natural environment and causing further damage to the ozone layer. So how important is it for local political parties to include messaging on plans to tackle climate change? Just the other day, the president of the ANC spoke about electric vehicles. Do communities care? Should they care? Well, let's discuss this and other issues this moment now here on eNCA with Ndoni Mcunu. She's a climate scientist who's joining us now in studio here in Hyde Park. And we've got Desmond D'sa, a climate activist from the South Durban Community Environmental Alliance. And also via Zoom, we've got Reverend Dr. Rachel Mash, the environmental coordinator of the Anglican Church of South Africa, both, of course, on Zoom. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time. I mean, when you look at the manifestos and we are watching the current build-up to Monday local government elections and we're seeing reports of them, there's very little focus in terms of climate change, because the effects of it are also present locally. And in South Africa, we only talk about climate change when we are in the middle of power cuts. We think, oh, it's about energy, but it's about more than that. Desmond, can I start with you as an activist? Having witnessed some pollution during the July riots in and around Durban, are you disappointed when you are listening to these political parties ahead of Monday that they are not focusing on climate change?
Well, good afternoon to the listeners and good afternoon, Dan. Good afternoon to my fellow panelists. I'm absolutely devastated that the biggest crisis facing mankind and facing the species of this world has not been discussed in manifestos, has not the discussions that are taking place with all political parties, including our government. I was actually shocked and that our minister, Barbara Creecy, is attending the Glasgow Conference on Climate Change, the 26th Conference on Climate Change. But if you look at the policies that have been introduced for climate change, given that we had so much of problems in South Africa, we've had people die because of climate change. 71 people died in 2018 with those huge floods that we had in South Africa. That government hasn't gone far enough. That government is very limited in its legislation to ensure that business continues as usual and does not want to attack, does not want to deal with the fossil fuel industry, afraid to take the chances and the risk that is needed at this important time.
Yeah, we will talk. Yeah, Desmond, let me come in there. We'll talk about what's happening in view. We've got a bit of time. We'll talk as well as what should happen. But at the local government level, one would expect that there will be efforts, for example, in my view, for the use of renewable energy sources instead of relying on ESCO. Municipalities are still relying a lot on coal-fired power stations. There should be efforts in these manifestos. I mean, the ANC and the DA manifestos mention climate change just once. The EFF has a brief section in its manifesto, and those are the big three parties in the country. And everybody's saying it's disappointing. But I mean, there should be an effort. What do you think, Ndoni?
Yeah, I mean, there should be an effort, and that's always the conversation. And I think maybe there's a challenge of the government or leadership actually struggling to know how, and maybe they're not getting the right access to the information, or maybe it's not a priority. And so I think with governments and leadership, it's always about what's the hot topic, what are the priorities, what brings in more money, what's hot right now that's going to make us look really good.
Yeah, pun not intended.
Yeah.
What's hot right
now.
Yeah. Okay, but the church is got. I never knew that the church has an environmental coordinator, Reverend Dr. Rachel Mash. When I saw this, I thought, okay, so you as the Anglican Church are also concerned, but we've got elections coming up on Monday, and many of your faithfuls will be voting. I mean, what's the message the Anglican Church is preaching around climate change?
Thank you so much. I think the Anglican Church is taking the issue of climate change very seriously. First of all, we are called to care for creation. And also, climate change is a social justice issue, which is predominantly going to impact on the poorest of the poor. And so it has to be one of the issues that we look at when we choose who to vote for. And I think it's very disappointing that the majority of the parties have really not taken the issue of climate change seriously. If you look at, for example, many of the parties are focusing on water, but they're seeing it an infrastructure rather than looking at the future to say we are going to have more water in South Africa, and what steps do we need to take in order to reduce the impact of climate change, particularly because South Africa is one of the highest emitters of carbon emissions. Among the G20 nations, we are actually the worst country. We have the highest density of carbon of all the G20 nations.
Yeah, I mean, local government, I would think, would be on the front line of a climate crisis. I mean, most of the stuff that happens, whether it's flooding that Desmond was referring to, whether it's runaway wildfires like we see in the Western Cape now and again, it's localized. It's always at the local level. And globally, the United Nations, in recent research, shows that most of the successful climate emission reduction strategies have been done locally in all kinds of countries. One would have hoped that in this local government election, I'm talking now as a South African, as an ordinary South African, that these parties take it seriously, but they are not. I mean, Desmond, you are in Durban. You saw the pollution there that happened because of the riots there. Is eThekwini municipality, from what you know, very much aware of the urgency of the climate change crisis?
Well, it starts with the number one citizen. If he doesn't seem to be interested, then you're not going to get the rest of the officials carrying out their duties. In other words, there's a lack of political will. We have some good laws in Durban. We have the best air quality management plan. But if it's not implemented, you're not going to reduce the pollution that creates the climate change. So we have to start somewhere. And I'm hoping that the new politicians, the new elected councillors after Monday, that we'll be able to engage with them and also get them to understand that if you put the climate first, then the rest follows suit. And that's very critical and important.
Now, how do you do that? I mean, from a scientific perspective, I mean, it's a reality. Climate change is not a theory anymore. It's happening. But if you're seeing successes elsewhere in the world, Ndoni, where local authorities are putting together strategies, not just on renewable sources of energy, but on all kinds of infrastructure to assist. What should these incoming councillors really be concerned about? Because we can't ignore climate change. Just the other day we had Cyclone Idai that devastated Beira, Mozambique's biggest, second largest city. It went all across Mozambique into Zimbabwe, into northern part of South Africa, northeastern part, and all the way to Botswana.
So I think what they really need to focus on is we're getting warmer as a continent. And so issues like drought affect things like agriculture, food security. And accessibility to these kind of food and to our rural communities is going to be very difficult. It would be difficult in the sense of the food prices going up and people actually going more hungry. Flooding, water, how can we have our water using grey water in our toilets instead of using, first-hand clean water? Are all the things that we need to really focus on. Infrastructure, and to see how flooding plains affect households and affect the damage of it. How does it affect the livelihoods of people every day?
Yeah, and we talk about safety as well as part of an issue in South Africa, but there's also an argument to be made for creating more green spaces. Reverend, would you agree with that?
Yes, and that's definitely something that can be done very well at a municipality level. I think we often forget, we think about the carbon emissions from our transport and from our energy, but we also forget that we can create spaces which will reduce our carbon emissions by greening our municipalities, by planting more trees, by encouraging food gardens that are using organic farming methodologies. We can actually begin to offset some of the carbon emissions, and we can also help to reduce the pollution in our cities. And that can be done very effectively at a municipal level.
Yeah, and part of reducing emissions in urban areas would talk about waste reduction. because that's also important, how you deal with that. Dignified sanitation. I mean, Desmond, I keep on referring to July because we saw one particular river there after one of the factories was burnt and the chemicals had that chemical spillage. I mean, clean water, dignified sanitation, as well as environmental friendly spaces is very key at the local level.
Very important, because we saw, as you say, the July, Dan, that the July incident affected people in informal settlements, and they lost their livelihood. They used to use the river to wash and wash their clothing. All that was destroyed. Tons of fish were killed, and so people didn't have any food. Dignified means you've got to provide access to water, and the vast majority of our people that live in impoverished areas, such as your informal settlements, your hostels, and the poor flat dwellers, those are the areas where there is no access to water, and there's a lack of access to water. And when there are water problems and shortage of water, those are the people who bear the brunt the most.
Yeah, when I looked at some of the statements made by some of the parties in the manifesto, they use the right wording. It's scant. I'm sure you've seen that, Ndoni, Desmond, and Reverend Mash. But, I mean, climate change is real, and it is impacting on, as you said, food security, on economy and the environment. But what should we be holding these new incoming councillors accountable to in terms of climate change across the board? Because we're expecting a slew of new councillors, and in the big metros, but also in some of the smaller towns and rural areas. But as citizens, what would you say as a scientist, from a climate change perspective, we should be holding them accountable to?
So there's a lot of promises that are done in the policy in the manifesto, and I think it's now no longer about using catchy words. It's now actually about how do you plan to do it. So if you're going to say you want to make the economy green, how? Are you going to target Soweto? Are you going to put solar panels? Are you going to...
Yeah, because the days of tree planting, yes, it's important to plant trees, but it's not the main thing anymore.
So technology, what's the technology you're going to use? What are the education systems that you're going to put in place that's actually going to inform rural areas and locals to know more about climate change and how they, as individuals, can actually make change on the ground? So it's about the how, the step-to-step on one, we're going to do this, the second stage is this, and the third stage is that.
Okay, Ndoni, Desmond, and Reverend Mash, stay connected. We'll continue in a short while here as we talk about the fact that seemingly the environment might become a loser in terms of this election that's coming up, and how can you make sure that it doesn't, because climate change is real.